Hello, my name is Mohan Kelkar, and this is the video number 7 of my Energy Reality series. In this video, I'm going to talk about reliable fossil fuels. There are three important characteristics of fossil fuel being reliable. First is that they are available when we need it, so on-demand delivery. They're available at affordable prices, and their proximity to where the energy is needed. I will also contrast these reliability measures with some of the renewable sources. The first requirement is storage of the fossil fuels. Although my presentation is mostly US centric, some of the conclusions I'm going to draw are of course can be applied on a worldwide basis. So if you examine the cold storage, the total production in the US is about 700 million tons, and the storage is about 175 million tons, which is about 3 to 4 months worth of storage. For oil, in Cushing alone, 80 million barrels of oil can be stored, plus in strategic petroleum reserves, about 700 million barrels of oil can be stored. If the daily consumption in the US is about 18 million barrels, we have a storage of about 40 days. Most of the gas is stored at subsurface level in salt caverns, mines, aquifers, and depleted reservoirs. The total underground storage available is 5 trillion cubic feet. The current consumption in the US is about 80 billion cubic feet. This translates into storage about 60 days. For all the three fossil fuels, we have more than 1 month of storage available compared to many other sources. The fossil fuels have to be transported from where they are produced to where they are stored. Large amount of infrastructure has been built. Most of the coal has been transported using trains, barges, and trucks. For oil and gas, most of the transportation happens in large pipelines. The amount of infrastructure can be seen on this map in the United States. About 2.6 million miles of gas pipelines have been built. About 200,000 miles of crude oil, refined products, and other liquid pipelines are available to transport liquids. 500,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines are available to transport electricity. Assuming that about 2% of the GDP is invested in energy infrastructure over the last 100 years, between 2 to 5 trillion dollars of investment has been made in building this infrastructure. What about wind and solar compared to oil and gas and coal? A recent Princeton University study indicates that every year starting 2020, we'll have to invest about $80 billion to make sure that the transmission lines are available to transmit wind and solar generated electricity. This investment compares to the prior investment, which is almost 4 times more than what we have done in the past. When you look at the transmission infrastructure, the historical data indicates that we have built between 100 to 200 thousands of gigawatt miles every year. But the Princeton study indicates that if you want to go to net zero carbon emission for all the electricity generation, the speed at which we have to build these transmission lines is much higher than what has happened in the past. The current attempts to indicate that there will be a lot of resistance which will be encountered by the local communities and individual states when these type of transmission lines are built. So perhaps the timeline is much more optimistic compared to what is going to happen in reality. The storage of electricity generated by wind and solar is also difficult. To store 1 barrel of oil, it will cost between $15 to $18. Whereas if you want to store the same amount of energy which is generated by 1 barrel of oil in the form of electricity using Tesla Megapack, it will cost about $510,000, which means it will be about $30,000 more to store energy in terms of electricity compared to barrel of oil. The prices of fossil fuel have remained remarkably steady over the last century. This is a picture of oil price over the last 150 years. Although there have been fluctuations in the oil prices, once you remove the effect of inflation, although the prices have fluctuated, they do not have a clear trend indicating that the prices have increased over the last 150 years. The same thing can be said about the price of natural gas. Again, some fluctuations, but the prices have remained fairly steady. The same thing is true for the price of coal, indicating that we have been able to overcome the demand of fossil fuels by developing better technology and keeping prices relatively stable. There is also a population shift from rural to urban areas as there is more mechanization in farming. In United States alone, there has been almost 80% of the people living in urban areas compared to rural areas where only 20% of them live. And by 2100, it is expected that close to 100% of the population will live in urban areas and very limited number of people will live in rural areas. That type of shift is also happening slowly worldwide. Currently, about 50% of the population lives in rural area and about 50% of the population lives in urban area. But it's expected by 2100, 80% of the population will live in urban areas and 20% of the population will live in rural areas. As the populations concentrate in urban areas, there is a need to have energy source available which is in proximity to these concentrations of population. This picture also shows worldwide change from rural to urban areas from 1950 to 2020. In Europe, Latin America, and Northern America, this transformation is almost complete, but is also happening at a very fast pace in Africa and Asia. If you look at the picture of the US population density and you overlay on top of it where the natural gas fired power plants are built, you can see a very strong correlation between where the power plants are built and where the population centers are. Now contrast that to wind energy. Here is where the population centers are, and here's where most of the energy is generated. So the wind energy which is generated only in the middle of the United States will have to be transmitted to where the population centers are. If we examine the solar energy compared to where the population centers are, we'll find that most of the solar energy is concentrated in the southwest United States. And again, this electricity generated will have to be transmitted to where the population centers are. So to contrast fossil fuels versus renewable sources, we can see that for fossil fuels, we already have an existing extensive infrastructure for transport and storage, which is built over centuries. Whereas for renewable, a new infrastructure will have to be built at a significant cost, and the storage of renewable energy is still very difficult with the current technology. Fossil fuels have exhibited very stable prices, indicating their affordability, and that probably trend will continue in the future because the new technology will be developed. Renewable sources are intermittent, so we have to build much higher baseload capacity compared to fossil fuel, indicating a higher price structure. And finally, fossil fuel power plants can be built next to population centers, whereas renewable energy will have to be transported to the population centers at considerable cost. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please subscribe my channel if you like it. Thank you.